Record. Wonderful. I'm glad we can make this. Awesome. I see David. I see Roberto. Hey, Roberto, thank you for joining.
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to all. Thank you.
Um, Stacy, since you mentioned it, can you share the link to that maybe in the chat?
Sure.
Because
Yeah. One
wonderful.
second.
Okay, so maybe I can say a few words on, I think everyone knows why we're meeting. Um, but maybe the idea, just to reiterate it, and then we can do a brief round of introduction because it's super exciting to bring all these experts from various parts of the world together. And then, I'm pretty sure not everyone knows each other, so that's another great benefit of this. So the idea of this meeting here, jointly organized through the Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community, so activity in a pre-competitive space, is to hopefully provide a short potential opinion piece on the term and the confusion around the term validation, because people use this in all kinds of contexts, and I know there are a few papers out there, but maybe not 100% tailored to digital pathology or pathology and AI ML. So, in other words, the pervasiveness of AI and ML and the need for validating any of those tools brings back that term validation. So, that's the idea of this meeting to bring together a few experts and interested people with their respective domain expertise. And so, to kick this off, it would be great if we could do a round of introductions. And hi, Brandon. Happy New Year.
So,
Uh, Maybe we can go by order that's on my screen here. So maybe, Sandra, do you want to start?
Thank you, Joe. Also, thank you for the invitation. So I'm quite new in this round. We talked a lot about things in NI. I'm from the Public Health Institution of Germany, from Robert Koch Institute, and I'm with the Center for Artificial Intelligence in Public Health Research. So this is what I'm doing. So I do a lot of project management for them, and yeah. So thank you for the invitation, Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Blendman. I am an assistant professor at Yale University in the Department of Internal Medicine, um, section of medical oncology. I'm also an assistant professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Science in the Department of Computer Science. So that's where all my AI stuff comes in at.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. Stacy?
Hi, everyone. My name's Stacy Carney. I'm the CEO at Elevation Strategic Development. Our company specializes in developing diagnostic products with companies, whether that is in the CDX realm or in Class 2 or Class C devices in Europe. We do both US and European development. We function really to help companies navigate the regulatory process, the clinical trial process, as well as design a quality system. So we spend a lot of time talking about validation and how you develop these systems, both in the laboratory setting under CAP/CLIA or 15189, or in the regulated setting that will go under a regulatory review. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for including me, Joe.
Thank you, Stacy. Amanda?
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda D, and I am a biomedical engineer, and I am currently doing my PhD at Toronto Metropolitan University in AI engineering, and I work on creating generalizable computational pathology tools. I met Joe about a year ago, and I'm very excited to be working on this project.
Thank you, Amanda. Roberto?
Hello. Roberto Stragam, pathologist working.
Uh-oh.
uh-oh.
We must be onto something, if the internet is not complying.
As soon as he started talking, he was moving before.
Oh, I see April. Maybe we can switch to April, and then if Roberto comes back, we can go there.
Great. Hi, Joe. Nice to meet everybody. Thanks. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. My name is April Kadami. I'm an associate professor of electrical, computer, and biomedical engineering at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm also the PI of the Image Analysis and Medicine Lab. I bring both the academic and industrial kind of lens to AI development for computational pathology applications. And when Amanda told me about this project, it sounded kind of interesting. And so glad to be involved.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Hope the dentist wasn't too bad today.
It wasn't a good one today. I can tell you that. When
sorry.
you said ouch, I was like, yeah,
Sorry about that.
it
But
happens.
thanks for
Yeah.
making it. All right, Roberto, you're back.
Yes, so I don't know how much did you hear of my previous. It's storming in Belgium, so internet is in and out. So pathologist, working in Belgium. Two main research areas which I do in my free time as a hobby, a bit like Joe and Brandon, is working on the immune system in breast and lung cancer. And I'm moving also to GI cancer, all aspects of it. Development of a method to score immune cells, validation of technologies to score those same immune cells, integration of AI tools in clinical trials on those same immune cells, comparing different AI tools on those immune cells within clinical trials, prospective, retrospective, and prospective. Working with Brandon and Joe on developing reference materials to score the same immune cells. And it's I'm chairing a work consortium of pathologists with around 1,000 pathologists from nearly 60 countries from all continents. So I think this project led by Joe is very timely. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Roberto. I know Dave McClintock is on the call. He was one of the folks in Florida that re-encouraged me to help push this forward. And he put his info in the chat. If I'm just reading it. So Dave McClintock is the chair of the Division of Computational Pathology and AI within the Department of Lab Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic. He's been very, very active in the field, and I think he's also on another call in parallel, so he may join a little bit more active later. And then, last but not least, Brandon Gallus. Hi.
Good
Thanks for making.
morning or afternoon if you're not East Coast at least. I'm at the FDA. Term validation is just a little bit abused, it seems, these days, especially. I blame the computational pathology or the AI community for that. When I was first made aware that they use that for kind of internal training, it surprised me and I refused to believe it. And but now that I see validation in that position in the pipeline, rather than what I plain language understand validation to be, is something that happens at the end to demonstrate a certain level of performance. So we've written some guidance with the International Medical Device Forum, IDMRF regulator forum, and we specifically carved out validation as a term that is often defined in different ways. And so that anytime you use it, you should give a full context of what it means to avoid the complications, because I see it in all the submissions I get on AI devices when they define data sets. There's training data sets, and then there's validation data sets, and then there's testing data sets, and it gets confusing because each person or each company uses them very differently, and so any help in that, standardizing that, would be great.
Yeah, so one staying with that theme, in the most recent predetermined change control plan, which was finalized, the preferred verbs for these different stages were training, tuning, testing. And there's actually a footnote somewhere that says, the use of the term validation in that context is discouraged. And they refer to the IMRDF meeting or meeting notes or publication. But of course, at the same time, when you look at payer policies, the term analytical validation and clinical validation, or analytic validity or clinical validity and clinical utility then later, is still absolutely imprinted and it's written all over the place. And then, of course, the jargon in the lab is all over the place as well. So especially for, let's say, international collaborations, when someone says, yes, we validated this, often find myself almost being perceived as rude to ask, what do you mean with validation, right? Because as you said, Brandon, it's encouraged to specify. But I just wanted to maybe give the option. I know Roberto just texted that he needs to leave by 5:30, to give everyone a chance to maybe explain what they currently consider that term to represent, and what they would like to include, because we're still in the scoping stages of this project. Maybe Roberto, do you want to maybe start?
Well, yes. My current concerns on these terms is whether in computational pathology, the term analytical validity, and I'm careful with my wordings, is maybe not too overemphasized, and whether we should maybe not focus more on terms, on concepts like clinical validity, to have tools available for clinical practice use. The thing is these AI tools are sometimes very sensitive in what they can measure, and the variability in terms of morphology is so enormous that I have not seen one AI tool that is able to capture all these different varieties of cells and patterns that we see through a microscope. So it will always be suboptimal. And I have seen studies of people or manuscripts being rejected, or studies being stopped due to this overemphasizing that it's not sufficiently analytically validated, that the AUC curves are not sufficiently high to be even considered for a further diagnostic use or use in daily practice. And as you will see in the next months, when the manuscripts we have been preparing will be public, there is tremendous variability in AI tools, even if they measure the same variable. But if you consider outcome as a variable, as a metric, most of them practically measure or predict outcome in nearly similar manners. So the question then is how much analytical variability can we accept without compromising patient care? And I think these two concepts, if we narrow them too strongly, we will block progress, I believe. So we need to be very careful not to overemphasize concepts which we were used to 10 to 15 years ago. Thank you.
I think it's very interesting that you bring up the term variability in the context of analytic validity, which is, of course, a description here. I just want to quickly read what Dave McClintock wrote here. I agree that we should attempt to clearly distinguish between the ideas of technical validation from a data science, machine learning, analytical perspective versus the clinical validation of an AI tool is going to be put into practice. I think these two aspects of validation need to be made very distinct and clear. I think we agree. I also see Shannon who joined. Thank you, Shannon, for joining. Comments on these two statements by Roberto regarding the variability and how much variability we can accept, and the comment by Dave McClintock in the chat.
Maybe to add to that, what I think, and the following is more a gut feeling than a real rational thought, is that what we may call a golden standard in computational pathology, probably a combination of metrics from analytical validity and clinical validity combined. But don't ask me how it may look like. But I think that's probably what we would need, a combination of these two different concepts within one single metric. But that's a good feeling. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question? That was good, very great context. The difference between clinical validity. So clinical validity, I'm gathering it would be clinical validation, looking at outcomes, for example, something centered around patient care. And then there was the analytical validation. Is that more focused on like the performance of AI tools?
Yep.
Yeah.
For example,
Hey guys, I can comment.
Okay.
I managed to kind of get off I figured I don't really need to be part of the next meeting, so I've had that in the background, just using Copilot to recap it every so often. So I think my point on this, just so you guys know, is the idea that what we really need to do is kind of focus in on, there seems to be a lot of people where they look at it and they'll say, hey, this tool's been validated, and they just use that term generically. Nobody really knows what it means. You see it in papers, you see it everywhere in talks and that kind of stuff. We validated the model. And the problem is that people automatically assume that you can use it clinically, you can put it into practice. And so there needs to be a really clear distinction, with the idea being that, we need to define out what does it mean to do a technical validation where the model is performing as expected from a data science perspective, that, I put in the terms of my data science geeks in our team would be able to go ahead and clearly understand exactly what's going to happen. They have all the basics. They're publishing that model in a data science oriented type of paper, journal, that kind of idea, where they're really going through, and that kind of group is really providing all that context and saying, yes, from a peer review perspective, this is a good model. Then on the other side of it, even if that's the case, it may not fit a clinical use case. It may not fit what you need to do from a clinical perspective. It just means it's a good model, right? It's that's all means. It doesn't mean that it passed CLIA perspective. It's not going to pass FDA perspective from that perspective. All it is going to be that it's a good model. So now we have to put into that practice idea of what are those things that need to be done from a clinical perspective to show, and how much variability do you want in that clinical perspective to show that, hey, this model is going to perform well. What is the gold standard that you're comparing it to, and everything else, so that you can then put it into practice and feel like you're not doing harm to patients. So for me, the second part of it's really the SAMD perspective. The first part should be separate from that, and just saying, hey, we need to make sure that this model is technically viable and good. Does that make sense? There has to be a really clear distinction from that. Otherwise, you're going to get people who are just, hey, I validated the model, but yet they don't really understand how they don't understand the differences between those two things, because they are clearly distinct. The lab's going to put it into practice a different way. And the lab may trust that the vendor said, oh, it's validated, and they may be using it not as, because most of these models are not FDA cleared, so they're going to use it in a non-FDA manner. And then at the same time, you want to make sure that the lab is doing a very rigorous review. And then the question would then be, is it good enough to do it as an LDT or not? Or what does that mean? Because a lot of people are still thinking about that. I think one of the papers that's out there that I know some people from Mayo were on, Jansen Seeholt was one of them, and that the CAP sent out was the idea that, hey, they really kind of put together the idea of LDTs and NAI together and validating it as an LDT. And there's that distinction of where, like, does that even, they didn't really mention SAMD in that regard. And so the idea here is, where do we make that really clear as to what do you do technically, what do you do from a clinical perspective, where does SAMD come into play? That's where all that kind of needs to come together. I hope that was clear.
No, absolutely. And I agree 100%. And that's where I am with that as well. And one of the issues that I struggle with is, again, how we do these wonderful genomic signatures that everybody and their brother is using. Everybody here on the call should know exactly what that's about. And that's where I'm afraid that we're heading, and we're heading down that tunnel. And so making sure that we're very clear, very, very clear on what is, technically valid in terms of the performance, and what is actually clinically valid, and that hurdle needs to be higher, is going to be paramount when we talk about, what, the term validation actually means.
Yeah, so I think maybe, April, since you asked, maybe I can also try to give a distinction, because what usually is then missed when the word outcome comes into play, at least conceptually, unless we're talking very specific subset of companion diagnostics, outcomes usually come in the clinical utility, meaning whether the promised outcome can really be accomplished, and then it's considered clinically useful or meaningful. So that's clinical utility. A simple example is if a test let's say a PCR reaction can identify an EGFR mutation, yes or no. That would be the technical part. Applied to an AI ML tool, it would be, can this tool identify correctly whether a case is HER2 positive or whether there's cancer, yes or no? And you could test that with, let's say, positive and negative cases. It would by no means demonstrate that when you take this and put it on a cohort, which would be clinical validity, that it would identify the correct, let's say, prevalence or the correct subset of patients under technical challenges, etc. So to me, the let's call it analytic validity can be obtained with fairly artificial settings like, contrived samples, positives, negatives, limit of detection. But that really doesn't give you, for example, whether you can detect an EGFR variant at 35% or a HER2 low at 40%, which that's typically part of a clinical validity. And the one of the big discussion points, and I'm glad you brought up, Dave, the issue with LDTs is LDTs currently, at least under the framework, is sufficient to have analytic validity. And typically, when you go to an FDA authorization, they're asking for at least some point or some part of a clinical validity. And that is, no one prevents you under the LDT rule to perform clinical validity. It's basically optional, but it's not legally required, which is one of the big contentious areas that's there as well. So I know I just want to make sure that we hear the other option. Is anyone against emphasizing this distinction between technical or analytical and clinical validation as two really different subjects? Roberto.
Can I comment on? I certainly do not object, certainly not. The only thing that I worry about is, for example, if you compare, for example, 5 different tools that measure lymphocytes, that's a bit my area of expertise, all of them are equally good in finding a lymphocyte, but not all of them are equally good in finding the same spatial patterns of those lymphocytes. So I think you can measure one variable and find a 100% concordance and consider that as analytically valid. But if you measure spatial patterns, you see big variability between those tools. So analytical validity does not mean, in my perspective, or what I have seen, and I'm not a computer scientist, doesn't mean absolute accuracy across all models for the same type of variables. They should be able to measure lymphocytes all in the same manner. But what I saw is that all of them spatial patterns, they measure it differently, but they all seem to predict outcome in the same manner. So I wouldn't be too rigid in considering analytical validity as we have seen it before, comparing PCR assays where, for example, all of them need to find the same mutation. Because with AI, you can measure additional variables, and maybe we should be very rigid on a few of them and maybe less rigid on others. But that's the debate, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that the technical validation or the analytical validation shouldn't just be one measurement. So, segmentation accuracy could be like, for example, DSC. But we've started to look at the way that these measurements vary across different variables. So scanning devices and so on. And this is also important because I believe this speaks to Roberto's point about where the spatial patterns, the actual connectomes of the cells, they didn't look the same. They weren't the same. So, one measurement is telling you there's very good consistency or agreement with these tools, but then you look at another measurement. So multi-dimensional is important to give you, broad representation of how the tools are working, not just. And I do find that it's sometimes like if you go to like some of the more computer science-y conferences, they just care about that metric, average, DSC, we did this compared to this, 2% improvement. But for something that is really supposed to work clinically and robust and reliable, you need additional measurements, multidimensional kind of ways to measure the technical validation of your tools.
I like the term dimensionality here. So one of the things that I looked up before we met is some people talk about all of this being internal validation, but you could do external validation where you use really a different population, different data sets. And then we come to, is it local, right? So if you stay within the confines of your healthcare system versus if you really go to other healthcare systems. And then another dimensionality that I thought of, which is, did anyone produce this data prospectively? Right? Because at least in the early stages, you take a cohort, you may have positives, negatives, like Roberto called it, like there's some ground truth that might be imperfect. So you start building something. But then at some point, you have to switch and change and say, okay, now we assess this sort of prospectively. So single center, multi-center, local versus regional versus, really in a larger scale, prospective versus retrospective. And then, of course, internal versus external. Those are all dimensions that you can attach to a term validation to almost create a rubric to say how good was this, what you called validation. And I'm sure I know Brandon has spent a lot of time on these topics, so he may have some comments, but
Well, just that idea of providing the descriptors of what validation context was performed in. Everything from sites, even the number of samples, how did the reference standard get established? For anything serious, which is what comes across my desk often because people want to go to market and sell their products. The FDA isn't fans of checklists, but I believe that some good effort is done with checklists to describe the sites, to describe the truthing method, to describe the performance metric, and to have a very consistent way of presenting that information or, summarizing and consolidating it so that I don't have to read a whole bunch of documents. If I have a question, I know it belongs in this section about the performance metric or this section about the data set. And I think that sort of consolidation and summary would benefit my work a lot, and I think it would benefit the literature world. There's a lot of checklists out there that are very effective for journals to use when they review papers. You got the tripod, and my favorite, because I'm in diagnostics, is STAR-D. All of these are developed under the Equator Network. I think that's one of the primary organizations that develops these checklists. And starting with something like that is what I always find effective. And whether we can even build a database of examples so that people can contribute to that kind of database and reference that database and find examples so that they know how to describe their validation study. That's kind of my big picture research effort mission.
I have a small question actually, and maybe Brandon, it would be directed to you. Some of the studies that Amanda and I have read, because she actually validated a tool with 90 pathologists, is that when people are looking at, and I use the word validation here, right? Because I feel like we've technically validated it, and this was the application of the tool with pathologists, okay? And so the studies that we looked at that seemed to have achieved this clinical validation looked to prove non-inferiority to a pathologist. So, for example, if you the pathologists are going to score a tissue slide and they have to assign a percentage, then you would show that by using the AI, you're statistically not inferior than what the human would have done. So I don't really know where this would fall be with the two kind of groups that we've kind of talked about, this clinical validity versus the technical validity, because we're basically showing that our tool, our digital tool, is not inferior to the human. And is that how it's done? Is that how these tools are presented to the FDA?
A lot, I think, do find that as their pathway to clearance.
Mhm.
It's about the resources needed to define truth or establish truth.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's even more challenging to do that. And so there is no truth besides the pathologists. And that's where, non-inferiority doesn't even work, because you would have to demonstrate that the pathologists perform at a certain level of performance and then show that the model is not inferior to that. And another pathway that is not as pervasive or exemplified is interchangeability, where you show the range of evaluations by the clinical pathologists, and you demonstrate that your model is within that to some level of the interchangeability, so that you can't distinguish your model from pathologist. And that's where variances are more the performance metric versus sensitivity or specificity being the performance metric.
Okay, I'm just catching up on the chat here.
And I'll put one little wrinkle in the radiology space. We non-inferiority isn't really good enough, because we're talking about exposure to not ionizing radiation, and we want to have better performance than what we have. Otherwise, what we have is good enough for now. So when we see devices that are CAD, the software as a medical device, we typically ask for improved performance in the radiology space. Just because the risks are a little higher. Well, the risks of
this is clinical validity. Sorry.
So maybe two other quick things just to steer the discussion a little bit. There's also the term business validation, right? I think we all hope that machine learning and AI will eventually become part of clinical practice. And some of you, I know, have thought about who will actually pay for this. To pay for it, it has to show more than clinical validity. Some payers require it to have actual lasting care impact. Like Brandon just said, is it better than something that we have, which is not just non-inferiority, but it's like, will this change outcomes, which typically is subsumed under the payer term clinical utility. And if you can show clinical utility, usually there's a healthcare value, life saved, service improvements, care of life quality, let's say less time to diagnosis, or you prevent certain deaths from being performed. And then the question becomes, can you attach a value to this? And when a value comes into play, you could call that a reimbursement, you can call this revenue, you can call this profit, but that is typically a business concept. And to validate something from a business perspective is also a validation, but that's a fundamentally different term. So I just wanted to throw this out there, because the current presumed thing is, if you buy a scanner and if you have some AI tools, this will all be hunky-dory, happy, and ever after. But it's actually not quite like that. I know that this is a huge discussion when people discuss, look, should we go digital? Should we do implement computational tools? I know, Dave, you probably have some thoughts about this, but I think a business model validation is a fundamentally different validation than what we just discussed, but it's same, and absolutely related and relevant to the discussion of realizing medical AI ML.
I mean, Joe, to your point, I think what you're describing honestly is, there's a couple different questions here. One is, can we do it? And you can show technically that yes, you can do something using AI. Clinically, you can show yes, it's effective. But then the question is, should we do it from a business perspective? The idea being that just because it will save a little turnaround time and it is a little bit better analytically, but it costs 5 times as much as the current method, is it actually adding value? So the idea of how's it adding value, what you're doing with it, that I think is part of the equation. And you're right, it needs to be brought into the idea of people need to look at it from perspective. Just because you've shown clinically with a small trial that yes, it works, if you haven't gone through and figured out from a stakeholder perspective of what is the reimbursement, how are you going to get paid for this, how are you going to get that money back? I know for us in radiology, they've put a different set of a decent amount of models through SAMD into practice. The idea being that they're using them, they're all operationally focused, right? We've saved some turnaround time. We're doing things that nothing that's out of the ordinary, but it's the idea being that they're trying to, and they've done it basically with the idea being that from a return on investment perspective, you're saving radiologists time to do different things, and you're not really from that perspective, you're not getting reimbursement for it. And so the idea here is that the model that everybody's going to choose from a pathology perspective? Oh, we're going to go out there and do it from the idea of we're all just saving time and saving pathologists money, which we know doesn't, unless you're cutting pathologists, you're not going to see those savings anywhere. So it's not going to be real money. So the idea here becomes one of, or you're increasing capacity, but then you need to have the ability to show that as well. So I think fundamentally, this is the problem, and I think you're totally right. You need to have that ability to show that there needs to be some reimbursement. This is the whole problem of why AI is not catching on, because there's no CPT codes and that kind of stuff. How do you turn that into a true business proposition? That should be the final part of the equation that we need to address. So I think you're onto that pretty well. That all 3 of those things need to come into play. The idea of the technical validation or analytical validation, however you want to call it, the clinical validation, and then the business validation of understanding how you're going to put this into practice so it actually makes sense versus taking a loss every time. But hey, look, we did it. That kind of idea, which may be, there's always loss leaders in every business. That could be effective. I don't know. Hey, Jansen.
Hey, Jansen. You came to the right.
Hello. Sorry, I had another meeting at the same time.
No, thank you for joining. So we discussed the term validation in its various manifestations. Just to catch you up real quick, started briefly saying that the PCCP guidance distinguishes train, tune, and test, and then we spent some time on distinguishing technical validation from clinical validation, and that we should really keep those things apart. And then that there are many, many different descriptors of the validation context, to use Brandon's wording, and including internal, external, local, prospective versus retrospective, etc. And then, how was the truthing method established, or how do we know that, whatever we use to do certain things, that they're true. We had a quick discussion about non-inferiority, in assessing, for example, if a model is as good or not as good as a human. And then I just threw in a little point about business validation, which is ultimately what makes some of these solutions sustainable, right? To say, can we justify this from a cost effectiveness perspective? And yep. Yeah, perfect. This is the layered Gallus scale of impact.
This is a paper by Fryback and Thornbury. This is the hierarchy that they give in their paper. And it's something that you can ignore as much as you want and still be very productive in your life. But in this conversation, I think besides the different domains where validation takes different meaning and forms, at least in diagnostic devices, I think this hierarchy is pretty useful. And I've argued, I've had colleagues that argued that where the FDA belongs is at level 2, and then I've had some colleagues believe it's more at patient outcome, and so that's much further down that scale. And so you can see, you can imagine that these different scales are just harder and harder to address further down the list. And so I think that this framework at least is useful to helping us with our how we have the discussion. And I'm sure that there's a few other type of hierarchies that have kind of been established that can help us with the discussion or when we start writing things down.
Maybe I can step in there. If it is okay, maybe I can give a little bit insight in the public health view. I don't know if this makes it a lot more complicated, because it is complicated, the validation. So maybe from our research institutions, so we ramp up the research still, but once we have it, all the research is done and all the work, and we have a lot of AI applications, we plan to also translate this into the special procedures of the RKI. So it's totally important for us to have the term validation defined for this kind of translation to the special procedures of the RKI. So this is not the clinical side, but if you have the motility, for example, in heat periods, you need also to be sure that you have the right things done. So this is maybe a public health view on this. So it's not the clinical, but it's also a technical validation we have also, but then we have the validation for the special procedures we have at the RKI.
I think that ties very well together with level 6, right? Because the societal efficacy of, any elements here is more in the public health or also public policy sector, depending on how you would want to define that. So clearly we set out to write a simple, maybe short opinion piece on a list of possible ways to use the word validation, but I think there will be probably a lot of different things. I know some of you have already emailed me your favorite papers on the topic, so I will compile this, maybe an EndNote or something, and print it into just a document. But it would be fantastic, and some people had to drop off and some people joined, but I'm sure you have personally published or have some papers that you frequently cite in talks, etc., on this subject. So it would be great if we can combine this into some sort of literature review and then maybe split it out over the different dimensions that we discussed today. So clearly, an AI ML focus is timely, and I think we should keep that. So please keep that in mind. And then in terms of distinguishing analytic versus clinical, that's another important dimension. I think what Brandon has shared is that a regulatory science perspective on validation is probably also like a potentially separate vantage point. And then business validation, which is, more on, I didn't see that in that Fryback and Thornbury level, but
Societal efficacy could be policymakers deciding what to pay for.
correct.
And there's
Like the
your
cost,
payment right there.
correct. Yeah, the cost efficacy. Maybe we can adopt it, but
Yeah, I gave the high list levels, but each one has the metrics underneath it, and level 6 has cost benefit. So that's your cost to doing business or cost to go through the decisions on whether to include it in your organization or not.
Joe, real quick, go on one more time. I think one other thing to kind of keep in mind as we think about this paper is that not all AI is created equal. So the idea being we might need to do a little bit about what, again, define out what we're determining to be AI and what would be used, what would be used in a clinical sense. The idea being that now that we have generative AI with all the LLM use and everything else, there's agentic AI, there's our good old tried and true narrow AI tools where it's a single thing doing a single, hey, I have one model that's going to look at HER2 staining and give you a score. That's it, right? That kind of idea. Each of those are going to require different types of validation and the extent to which you're doing. If you're trying to create a tool that's going to generate a brand new report, independent of the pathologist and everything else that is gonna, or you're not just defining terms for a patient, but you're totally rewriting a report to give to a patient in a fifth grade terminology and that kind of stuff. All these different ways, or if you're putting in a tool to comb the patient history and give you all the different examples and any question you want to ask about a patient, you can get the answer for. How do you validate that in general is a big question overall for all of us in terms of where this goes. And I think that's an example of where we need to kind of define out what we're describing from a validation perspective, because not all validation is going to be equal here when it comes to those kind of different models. So I think that's going to be a different point we have to make sure that we actually talk about, because it's going to be all over the board.
And that applies to model validation or the clinical validation of that model, right? Because you could argue
and the
that
business validation.
Exactly.
You're not going to get a CPT code for every time that you put in a prompt on tell me about this patient. You're not going to be billing for that kind of stuff. So it comes down to the different, and then that's the operational versus the actual diagnostic. There's different ideas of what you're doing for this and what do we mean by it. So we all kind of think in our own terms what we're used to working in, but there's going to be so many different types of models, and it'll be based off of how you're using them. It's going to be important for us to understand what that looks like.
So I would just caution that it's going to be quite ambitious if we try and tackle that in our first write-up. I certainly believe it can be addressed in a discussion section so that another write-up can go into these large language models and generative AI tools. But, I don't think anyone has any hierarchies or kind of really plans on how to, the plans to validate them are just getting off the ground.
No, that was my point. I don't think that we need to define it out and we don't need to explain it all. I think we just need to basically say, hey, what we're talking about here really applies to these kind of narrow, typical AI tools that we see in practice right now. But going forward, there need to be additional discussion on blah, 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 that kind of idea.
And I think there's definitely value, because it actually is going to be the future, that we do need actually to state it and bring it out there as a point for discussion, and so I think there's definitely value that we need to kind of, add it in.
So one thing that we discussed at some point, I think it's fair to say over some drinks in Florida at the Visions meeting, was to provide negative examples, right? To say where people really use the term wrong, or where we really try to emphasize, look, this should not be considered validated because you just trained the model and did, fourfold cross-validation or something like that. So I wanted to run this by the group to say, should we try to include examples, where, similar to what April said earlier, this is, we used the model, we tested it against X pathologists. Is this AV or CV? That's a simple example, but I think I'm personally aware of some validation studies that are not really validation studies, because the term is then used as validated, but there's no independent cohort. There's no, true assessment of the performance in an independent data set. And, sometimes it's very tough to describe what's right when it is actually fairly simple to illustrate how it's wrong. Or, that performance typically goes down when you use a fully independent data set with the same ground truth, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to hear whether or not there's sort of a preference of whether we want to include some, misunderstanding, misconceptions, or practical examples that that might make the point a little bit more clearly than us trying to, explain everything.
As long as it doesn't bloat the paper, I'd say yes. Because for what I've seen from feedback from other papers, people would like to see those examples because otherwise they're kind of like, well, you're just talking about, sure, yeah, this is important, but you're not giving any concrete reasons as to why. So I think it makes sense for us to do it. But again, it may be in a figure, maybe as a table, but the idea being that it has to be something that doesn't bloat it.
Okay.
It's a bit challenging, Joe, depending on the framework that you're working in. Like the FDA works in a framework that things need to generalize to other laboratories if this is going to be marketed as an in vitro diagnostic. So the independent data set is very critical in that kind of framework. If you're developing this for a single lab and you're only going to use it in that lab, pending all of what is going to happen in the courts with regulation of LDTs, you don't technically need to demonstrate that it performs equally well in an independent data set from another site. It might be an independent data set from your site. So I think it's going to be tricky to flesh that out right now.
Yeah, and the language that we use there, I mean, as long as we can find that right language, but if people are going to hold on to certain language, like this is the wrong validation, it's all based on context and claims and things like that. I do try and work hard to find the right language that makes the point, but allows me to still be a co-author. And if needed, it could be rather than bloating this paper, it could be a nice spin-off editorial if there's something that's created like that. And so I don't want to discourage anything. I just want to put out that there's certain things, recommendations. I would have to back out of a paper that is about recommendations.
Well,
I think it could be purely descriptive. This is the FDA's focus when validating an in vitro diagnostic, and it needs to be done in independent studies, at usually 2 or more studies with a certain power to demonstrate that it will be useful for a broader market. And for an LDT, that may not be a consideration.
So in terms of scope, at least to provide some sort of outline, we have previously put together a little paper on regulatory science, and I put the link in the chat. The paper is actually fairly short. It's more like a correspondence, I think, or whatever the article type is called, or a comment. But then the supplement had a lot of information that we were able to just link people to when they ask, so what is regulatory science? And I was considering this could be something similar. If someone asks, what do you mean with validation? Then we can say, look, we met with a group of experts from different, areas in healthcare, regulatory, scientists, industry, and we put together this little overview. And I think if we keep the paper fairly small, and Dave, I agree, the examples could probably be in a supplement or something, and then we can have as many tables and references in the supplement to just say, look, if you're more interested in, modes of validation of different types of models, you can just look there. But it would be a pointer that we can, reference, and that is one of the deliverables of the PyCC community. And just but happy to write a larger scale paper, and but I thought clarifying that validation is really a muddy, murky term that requires specification with a little bit tailoring to more diagnostics and digital path AI ML applications. That was sort of the idea. Okay, so next steps. One is, I think we should definitely try to converge publications. I know that there's a bunch in the chat. I will compile all of those. And then if someone else has a good resource or is good with managing references, definitely looking for volunteers. And then maybe if you plus the people in the email, I send a follow-up email, could share the references that you believe are pertinent to this. And then I think we can compile that and maybe sort it across the different dimensions that we discussed today. And then I think have another meeting and see whether we can hopefully provide a sort of starting point for what an opinion piece around this could look like.
That sounds great. I've actually taken note of all the papers that have been placed in this chat, so I can definitely help with that.
Awesome.
And Dr. Kademi and I have also a list that we can organize and add.
Perfect. And I see Sandra also said she can help. That's awesome. Okay, so I'll follow up in an email, provide maybe a bullet point summary of today, and then we create a subpage on the PyCC website with the recording, and then let's collect some references and then group them and hopefully meet again.
Sounds great. Great
Thank you.
effort and idea. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks
Take
again.
care.
Great seeing you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.